Thank you, everybody, for joining us again on another day in the Middle East where we're never quite sure exactly what's gonna happen next. So kind of warning that anything I may say over the next hour may be out of date by the time we finish the lecture. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen and begin with a quick, very quick recap of some of the things that we've discussed over the last couple of weeks. So as many of you will be aware, this is the third of a three-part series. So we started off talking about, our general theme is a changing Israel in a changing world. We began by talking about a changing Israel and a changing West. Last week, we talked about a changing Israel and a great power competition. And this week, we're talking about a changing Israel in a changing Middle East. And just to kind of recap a couple of the key slides and ideas that I mentioned in the first couple of weeks for those that were here, and just kind of a hint for those that might have missed it. The very first thing I began to talk about was that we're in a moment of global competition. And the map that I've just brought up on the screen, which signifies the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, is supposed to symbolize one aspect of this great power competition, a competition between powers that are rising to rival the dominance of the United States, China first and foremost, but others as well. And the competition is about material stuff. It's about who controls access to raw materials, who controls trade routes, who controls what gets made and sold where, who controls the technologies of the future, who controls what kind of and who holds access to what kinds of military technologies. This is the classic stuff of great power competition and rivalry, but it's not just about material things. There's also a global competition over ideas, and I showed a couple of times this slide. This picture of the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, and this joint statement they put out a couple of years ago, where they pushed back on the idea that kind of Western liberal ideas are universal ideas that should be, adopted by all societies. And they said, we have our own civilizations, our own values, we have our own idea of what democracy means, and we're not going to be told by the West what kind of human rights values or what kind of democracy values we should hold to. So that's a kind of global level framework. And in the first week, I talked about the fact that there's not only a kind of global competition taking place at a global level between great powers about material stuff and about ideas. There's also an ideas contestation happening within societies, including in Western society. So if we used to have a kind of, consensus in many Western societies between kind of center left and center right, a kind of consensus about liberal democracy and about liberal internationalism. Today, in many Western societies, including the United States, including many European societies, we have a radical left and radical right parties, often populist parties, that are challenging that former mainstream consensus, and deep ideological divides emerging in Western societies about values and identity. And you see some of the characters on the screen, and we talked about them as symbolic of these deep divides about who we are, what our values are, what we stand for as societies. So challenges both from the radical left and the radical right. And we've also saw and talked about deep divides within Israeli society. And I talked a little bit about the multi-layered Israeli crisis, the immediate political crisis, how that sits in a deep-lying social and ideological divide. And that in itself sits within this wider global picture of ideas divides and contestation of ideas that's happening in many multi-party democracies, including in the US, in Europe, and many other places. And last week, I spoke a little bit about some of the interactions between in the first week, I spoke about the interaction between those divides in Western societies and the divides in Israel, how attitudes towards Israel are polarized in Western societies, and about how to respond to that is a polarized question in Israel. Polarized between different camps in Israel who have different ideas of what Israel should be, of what Israel should stand for, those that prioritize the liberal democratic character of Israel, and want to keep that in balance with Israel's Jewish character, and those that want to raise up the ethnic Jewish or Orthodox religious Jewish character of Israel over the liberal democratic character of Israel. So a divide in Israel about how to respond to polarization in the West. But also a divide in Israel about how to respond to this great power competition that I mentioned. And the map I've just brought up on the screen now is a sort of symbol or emblematic of how that great power competition impacts directly on Israel. I showed this map last week of Haifa Bay, two major port facilities in Haifa, and we discussed the fact that one of them is recently been bought by an Indian-led consortium, and one of them is operated by a Chinese company. So we see the impact of this, of these rising powers in Israel seeking to dominate and or have influence and control over infrastructure, key infrastructure points all over the world. And we saw a little bit of the implications of that for Israel's relations with the United States. It's kind of a most important a great power ally. And we saw divides within Israel about how to respond, how to position in terms of great power competition. And that includes also how to respond, for example, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we talked about how you have significant notable differences between the sort of Israeli center-left, the leadership of Yair Lapid when he was prime minister and foreign minister, more ready to condemn Putin in line with mainstream liberal democratic leaders in the West, and Netanyahu, who has until this day, as far as I'm aware, not condemned Putin over his invasion of Ukraine, and much more cautious, wanting to guard more carefully his relations with Putin, not wanting to offend Putin. So we talked about what explains that divide, and I would argue it's linked to this deep values divide inside the state of Israel. So this week we're moving on to focus on the Middle East, because the Middle East is also a region that is divided, that is polarized. And I can signify that also in a couple of ways, with a map and with some images. So what you see on the screen right now, a map at the top, which signifies or attempts to depict the sort of struggle, the great struggle taking place within the Middle East today. What you see in green in the map there is Iran and its axis of resistance. So the states and regions colored in green are supposed to signify states and regions that are aligned with or allied to Iran and its regional agenda. And it's there's a lot more subtlety and complexity than this map can signify, but it gives us an idea. And in red, you see states that are opposed to Iran's regional agenda. So what is that about? What is that struggle about? Well, the way I see it, a little bit like that global struggle that I mentioned, it's a struggle about material stuff, like who has access to what kind of military power, like nuclear weapons, for example. It's about who controls energy and trade routes. It's about the long-term status of the United States and its military power in the Middle East. It's about those kind of state rivalries, strategic rivalries, security rivalries, who will dominate. But it's also about ideas and values stuff. Iran is, as you're aware, an Islamist state whose regime claims to defend Islam against the toxic cultural influence of the West. And Iran's ideological leaders see the influence of the US as toxic to the Middle East, and they see Israel and Jews and the presence of a Jewish state in the Middle East as a kind of demonic threat to Islam. And the Iranian regime has that ideological drive, but it also wants to promote and advance a religiously and socially conservative region in line with its own values. And it sees the influence of the West, including the US, as not just a kind of military threat, but also a threat, an ideas, values, cultural threat. It wants to get the US out of the region, and it wants to get rid of America's main ally in the region, Israel. And against that, and Iran works and has built axis of allies aligned with that goal. And you're familiar with who these actors are: Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian arena, Hezbollah in South Lebanon, its most powerful and most loyal proxy in the region, and also the Houthis in Yemen. You see them. You see the green splodge in Yemen at the bottom of that map there. A more recent power to emerge as a regional power and a direct threat to Israel, as well as to its nearer neighbors, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So this is Iran's kind of network of allies aligned to its goals. And against that alliance, there are states that, for a variety of reasons, have close relations with the United States and either have peaceful relations with Israel or would like to have peaceful relations with Israel. And that includes the countries that Israel has had diplomatic relations with for many years: Egypt and Jordan, now also the Gulf states, the UAE and Bahrain that normalized their relations with Israel recently, also Morocco, that's a little further away, and also Saudi Arabia, which does not have normalized relations with Israel but would like to have. And generally, these states, unlike Iran and its allies, want a relatively socially and culturally tolerant Middle East because they want to, and I'm thinking in particular about those Gulf states, they want to diversify their economies. They want to be open to Western economic investment. They want the benefits of peace with Israel and strategic alliance with the United States. They want to keep the United States in the region to help defend them against Iran. So if we think about Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, for example, traditionally a very, very conservative state dominated by a very puritanical interpretation of Islam. Today, Mohammed bin Salman knows that for his regime to sort of sustain itself economically, he needs to change that social model. He needs to diversify his economy. He needs to liberalize the society. He needs to get women into the workplace. He needs to open up Saudi Arabia to Western tourism and investment like the UAE has done very successfully. And like Qatar has done in certain respects, and other Gulf states. And so we see transformational changes taking place in Saudi Arabia. And I can kind of, when we see Saudi Arabia, for example, hosting major sporting events, buying golf tournaments, Premier League football teams, Cristiano Ronaldo, for those of you that are football fans, hosting music festivals. They're going to host the 2034 Football World Cup, following the model of Qatar a couple of years ago. And this is in stark contrast to the kind of social political model of Iran. And I'm signifying this on the screen here with two images that you see at the bottom of the screen, which really kind of underline this contrast between the visions for their societies, but also for the region of Iran and in this case, Saudi Arabia. So on the left, you see an image of a female protester in Iran with the slogan "A woman, life, freedom." And if you've followed developments in Iran over the last couple of years, you might be familiar with this protest movement led by Iranian women protesting against restrictions on their freedom, but in particular the imposition where they have to cover their hair in public. And women protesting for the right to decide for themselves if they want to cover their hair or not. And that was kind of the focal point of a major protest movement in Iran, which was suppressed very brutally by the Iranian regime. So we contrast that image on the left-hand side of the screen with the image on the right-hand side of the screen of the Aramco. This is, a Saudi big state oil company, Saudi Ladies International Golf Tournament, right? So this is a screenshot that I've taken from the website of this golf tournament sponsored by Saudi Arabia, where you see a woman She happens to be wearing a hat, but her hair is not covered. You can see the way she's dressed, very modern. She's a sportswoman. And this is from a kind of Saudi-sponsored sports tournament. And if you go to the Visit Saudi Arabia website, you'll see on the front page a picture of a smiling family with a woman whose hair is not covered. And it's a symbol of a dramatic change that is being driven in Saudi Arabia to change these kind of social attitudes, to reform the nature of the society, because it's an economic necessity from the perspective of Mohammed bin Salman. Still, must say, a very long way to go. It's still, this is still a society, and indeed to some extent other Gulf societies that still have many gender inequalities and restrictions on women's rights. But there's a direction of travel to liberalize the society that is very, very striking. And you can imagine that if you are the regime, Iranian regime in Tehran, how threatening that process might seem when you're suppressing protest movements in your own society, women demanding social freedoms, and you have these Islamic states in your neighborhood that are granting women and the sorts of freedoms that you want to deny to women in your society, that are in a process of liberalizing something that women in your own society can see. You can see how this is a potential threat to your legitimacy, to your regime, to your ability to control your population. So we see it's not just ideological, it's also about kind of different models of regime survival and legitimacy. Now, I want to try and think a little bit about what these differences, these different approaches, these different models, different social models, different political models mean for Israel and its place in the region, and think a little bit about that normalization process that we saw happening between Israel and Arab states prior to the 7th of October. Of course, the 7th of October has changed dramatically the context for all that I'm discussing right now, and we're going to come to that. But I want to try and set a context for the 7th of October by trying to understand some of these processes that were taking place prior to 7th of October. So I'm going to flash up an image now. And this is a moment where we can maybe be a bit interactive, and I can invite you through a kind of pop quiz. I hope you can see the image. Let's start with the image at the top of the screen. I'm going to try and open my chat, and I hope I don't bring my computer crashing down. But can anybody identify any of the individuals you see in the top image there, or identify what event has been captured in the image in the top half of the screen there? Okay, we have a spot for Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. That's a good start. Anybody else can identify any of the other figures on the screen? I've had a signing of the Abraham Accords. It's a good guess. It's not correct, but it's along the right lines. It's linked to the Abraham Accords. I'm going to give you a clue. It came after the Abraham Accords. You may recognize an Israeli politician there, which will give you a clue about when this photograph is taken. Lapid, that's right. Yeah. So at the moment this photograph, Yair Lapid was the foreign minister in Israel. So that dates it in the first half of 2022. Okay, so I'm going to help you out and going to tell you who else we see in this picture here. We see the foreign minister of Bahrain. We see the foreign minister of Egypt. We see the foreign minister of Morocco and the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates, together with Blinken and Lapid. So the leaders of 4 Arab states. And this photograph is taken at Sde Boker in the Negev. Some of you may have been to Sde Boker, may know Sde Boker, famously associated with Israel's founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, but also there's a kind of resort there. And they held this meeting at Sde Boker, and it was called the Negev Forum. It was launching something called the Negev Forum. What is the Negev Forum? So in the wake of the signing of the Abraham Accords, normalization of relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Morocco, which happened late 2020. So this is a kind of evolution of that. not only Israel developing bilateral relations with each of these states, but starting to build a kind of regional alliance, bringing together leaders of these states in Israel, of course, with the support and sponsorship of the United States, to start to talk about regional cooperation, multilateral cooperation, all these states working together. They talked about cooperation in many different fields, economic cooperation, health, technology, transportation, but also military security cooperation. Explicitly, they're talking about how they can work together on to help with one another's defense and security. Also, how they can cooperate on a military level. So just think about the potential of this kind of integration. You see those four Arab foreign ministers pictured there. You'll notice Jordan not included, even though Jordan has normalized relations with Israel. There was certainly hope that Jordan would also be a participant in this process. And of course, down the line, ultimately, Saudi Arabia, as well as potentially other Arab states. If you think about the potential of that multilateral cooperation, something we never saw in the history of the state of Israel, something really very, very extraordinary. What brings these states together? What motivates them after all these years to want to engage in this level of cooperation and multilateral cooperation between themselves and the state of Israel? Well, Israel, of course, wants normalized relations with Arab states, and it always has. It wants the economic integration opportunities. It wants to be integrated into the region. It wants that security cooperation. And those Arab states want those economic and security ties with Israel. And they want Israel and the United States in their corner against regional threats, including the threat of Iran. And whereas previously those Arab states, with the sort of exception of Egypt and Jordan, demanded a Palestinian state before they would normalize their relations with Israel, over recent years, they got a lot more flexible. I mean, they still want to see a Palestinian state. They still want to see a two-state solution, but they were willing to put normalization with Israel ahead of concrete progress towards a Palestinian state. And many amazing possibilities that come out of these countries working together. I mentioned one of them last week, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. I'm going to come back to it. And there are others as well. Before I talk about some of those other potential sources of cooperation, let's just look a little bit at the image at the bottom of the screen there. Any guesses? And again, maybe Sherelle, we can open up the chat. Can anybody identify any of the figures you see in the bottom of the screen there, or any of the organizations? Can you guess any of the organizations that they represent? Not seeing any guesses. I might have to help you out. Okay, yes, Iran, Hezbollah, Sinwar. Sinwar is not pictured here, but his colleague, his late colleague Ismail Haniyeh, is pictured there. And you do see Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, and some of their allies from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, from the Houthi group in Yemen. And these are screenshots from videos. It's a composite of screenshots of videos they recorded in 2020 to celebrate something called Al-Quds Day, which is a day of, I guess, essentially a day of protest against the existence of the State of Israel, promoted and sponsored by Iran since Iran was established in 1979. So this is the kind of symbolizes the array of actors in the region who sit on the opposite side of this regional divide. Okay. I'm going to show another image in a moment. And it's a symbol of, here it is, and it's a symbol of that potential cooperation, or the potential of cooperation we have that comes about as a result of this increasing, or this move that we saw prior to October the 7th, of increasing integration between Israel and Arab states. This is the signing ceremony of something called Project Prosperity. You can see the caption there at the event. You might recognize John Kerry, who is the United States Special Representative, the United States Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. That's what he's doing there. But you also see there representatives of the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Jordan, and the State of Israel. And they're signing an agreement for something called Project Prosperity. What is Project Prosperity? This is an agreement, a memorandum of understanding that was signed in November 2022, so just 2 years ago. The idea is this. Jordan is short of water. Israel actually has an excess of water because it's very good at desalinating water. So the idea is that Israel provides excess desalinated water for Jordan. And in return, Jordan, which has more available land in Israel, builds a solar energy field in Jordan that will provide electricity to Israel. And the contractor to build the solar energy field in Jordan will be Emirati, okay, a company from the UAE. So it's a trilateral renewable energy water cooperation agreement, kind of win-win-win. Okay, brilliant concept. Each country lending its where it has an advantage, contributing to the needs of the other in a renewable, sustainable way. For those that are not aware, the Arabian Peninsula and that region is the optimal region for collecting solar energy, and it's so it's really a fantastic opportunity. So that's Project Prosperity. It's a symbol, really, of that immense kind of potential cooperation if you have deep cooperation between Israel and surrounding Arab states. Now, that's pretty cool. In my view, and you'll recall, those of you that were in the lecture last week, something else pretty amazing, this proposal for an India, Middle East, Europe corridor, the idea that you can create an trade and energy and digital communications corridor from India to Europe that goes through the Arabian Peninsula via the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. Of course, that, in essence, depends on developing normalization between or bringing Saudi Arabia into the circle of peace, deeper cooperation and integration between these states. But if you can get that, then you can create this incredible, geostrategic, game-changing opportunity from which everybody would benefit massively. Also hugely exciting, another example of a hugely exciting opportunity that comes out of deeper integration between Israel and Arab states in the region. But if you think, if you're still not impressed with those sorts of things, I want to show you something else. I'm going to show you a clip now of a Saudi project. Promoting a Saudi project called NEOM. I don't know if any of you have heard about NEOM, but what I'm going to stop the share and share it again so that I can optimize the share for and Cheryl, maybe we can open the chat and people can just give reactions if they want to, just kind of what their reactions are when they see this clip. What do they think? Okay. What do you think of when you see, what is your impression when you see this promotional clip for something called NEOM? I hope this is all going to work.
What is NEOM? This is NEOM, or here, to be more precise, in the northwest of Saudi Arabia. But NEOM is more than a place. It's a home for people who dream big. Bigger than that. That's more like it. It'll be a hub for innovation, an entirely new model for sustainable living. The vision for a new future. In fact, that's how it got its name. But what will be there? There's Oxagon, a thriving city at the crossroads of the world, where advanced manufacturing will enable industries of the future. Trojana, a year-round mountain destination. And just remember to pack your skis when you visit. Or if skiing's not your thing, there's always Sindala, one of NEOM's many beautiful islands. Perfect for some R&R. And the line, a 500-meter high, 200-meter wide, 170-kilometer-long city in the shape of, well, a line. No roads, cars, or emissions. And everything its 9 million residents could ever need within a 5-minute walk. But best of all, the entire region will offer unparalleled access to nature and will be powered by clean energy. All within easy reach of the rest of the world. I know what you're thinking. Why does the world need NEOM?
That's a good question.
The world...
Okay, for shortage of time, I'm not going to show the entire clip. I don't know if anybody posted any impressions. I'm not seeing anything, but okay. So I'll tell you at least. Okay, I'm seeing some skeptical reactions, which is totally reasonable. Okay, yeah, I hear it. Okay, so you're not. I'm quite sure you're not the only people to react skeptically to the promotional materials around NEOM. But stunned. I'm also stunned. But believe it or not, Saudi Arabia is spending $500 billion on this thing. Some people say its budget is going to reach $1.5 trillion. And it would sound completely amazing if, obviously, you're aware, Saudi Arabia sits on 20 to 25% of the world's proven oil reserves. They have a lot of money. They see an immense need to diversify their economy. This thing is being built. There are diggers on the ground. Now, there are many people who, like some of you, are skeptical that it's going to live up to its claimed potential. But the point is, they have a vision, Saudi Arabia, of building a transformational tech, innovation, tourism, trade hub of epic scale. And where is it? Geographically, I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay. Just a moment. It's here. It's barely 100 miles from Eilat. Okay, it's nearer to Eilat than Jerusalem or Tel Aviv is. Okay, so it's sort of on Israel's doorstep. So to my mind, at least, it's another kind of symbol of what kind of potential comes out of this movement that we're seeing in Arab states, particularly Gulf Arab states, and especially the kind of big beast of the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, to change their economic, social models, maybe not their political models. They'll remain very autocratic, monarchical states, but nonetheless, their economic and social models in ways that create immense opportunity for Israel. So huge potential in terms of this social change, in terms of regional integration, but not only significance in sort of potential sort of economic cooperation and security cooperation, also potential in terms of cultural and values shifts. And we saw that in the agreement that was signed between Israel and the UAE. The text of which is very fascinating to me. So this is from the preamble of the peace accord signed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Recognizing that the Arab and Jewish peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and inspired in that spirit to foster in the Middle East a reality in which Jews, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and peoples of all faiths, denominations, beliefs, and nationalities live in and are committed to a spirit of coexistence, mutual understanding, and mutual respect. Now, I don't know how many people on this call believe that Arab and Jewish peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, but it is written in the signed treaty of diplomatic relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which to my mind is pretty extraordinary. There's no similar sentence like this in any of the other peace agreements between Israel and Arab states, although there is a tradition of both Arab leaders and Israeli leaders talking about using this kind of language when talking about their relations and their making peace with one another, going back to Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt back in the 70s. So there's a history to this kind of thing. But this is the first time it was written into a treaty. This idea that Jews and Arabs are are ethnic kin. They are kind of cousins of one another. An idea which completely contradicts the kind of historic, certainly the Islamist narrative that says that Jews have no place in the region and are a threat to Islam, the traditional Arab and Palestinian nationalist narrative, the kind of left anti-colonialist narrative, all which suggests that Jews have no real place in the region, are not indigenous to the region. This message that which Israel and the UAE signed up to is completely contradictory to all those messages. I gave a lecture for CSP a few months ago, specifically about this stuff. I won't go into too much more detail now, but just another symbol of that kind of shift in parts of the Arab world is the development of this building project. Again, I'll do this maybe as a pop quiz if anybody knows. Perhaps somebody who may have been in one of my previous lectures. What building is captured in the photograph here? Does anybody know? Give a moment if anybody wants to jump in with an answer. It is a synagogue, absolutely right. Does anybody know where that's? Well, yes, the image on the right is the interior of a synagogue. It actually, if you see on the image on the left, there's 3 buildings, and it's the right hand of those buildings is a synagogue. This is the Abrahamic family house. It's a synagogue, a mosque. Oh, yes, well done, Tom. Abrahamic house, correct. It's a synagogue, mosque, and church built on one site in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. This is a construction project created by Abu Dhabi, by the Emirati authorities, as a symbol of coexistence and commonality, shared culture between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I won't go, for lack of time, into all of the sort of details and the motivation, and you can sort of thank you, Sherelle. You can go back and watch, but it's quite a remarkable project. I visited it myself just a few months ago. You can see just a photograph I took at the bottom of the screen, and you can see how prominent this is on the skyline of the Abu Dhabi cultural district. It sits right next to the new National Museum under construction. You can see the cranes right next to it, to the left-hand side there. It's a very, very prominent symbol of the value of tolerance and coexistence that the UAE is trying to promote. We could go into all kinds of discussions about why it's trying to promote those values of tolerance and what its motives are. But it's a remarkable symbol of, so not only a sort of shift in the Arab world in terms of opening up changing their social and economic models, more interested in normalization with Israel, and also kind of changing cultural attitudes or attempts, top-down really, attempts by leaders in the Gulf to change cultural attitudes, certainly in this case, in the case of the UAE, towards Jews. So, pretty striking changes. I think about that as a context to October the 7th. Because when we think about October the 7th, well, before I talk about October the 7th, of course, there are some serious catches in this kind of normalization process that we've seen, and you'll be familiar with them. One of them is, of course, the Palestinian question, right? Saudi Arabia was even before October the 7th demanding some significant Israeli concession to the Palestinians, really some kind of serious commitment to a process towards Palestinian statehood as a condition for normalizing its relations with Israel. So that was a big catch for really realizing, the next level potential of Israeli-Arab normalization. That clashed, of course, with shifts in Israeli domestic politics, big shift to the right, election of a very hard right government with far right elements in it, with no interest in making compromises on the Palestinian question, even pushing changes to the status quo on the Temple Mount, wanting to expand settlement construction, annex the West Bank, and so on and so on. And of course, the eruption within Israel prior to October the 7th of a deep kind of divide in Israeli society triggered by the judicial overhaul, the attempts to change the sort of constitutional changes in the state, inside the state of Israel. So all of that were big catches, big problems in trying to realize the potential of this kind of normalization process. And then, of course, October the 7th happened. We don't know why exactly Hamas did exactly what it did at the moment that it did it. But clearly for Hamas, along with its allies in the region, they perceive this normalization process as a threat to Palestinian national goals and the wider goals of the axis of resistance. The idea of normalization of Israel, possibly even without the realization of a Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, was obviously a major, major threat from the perspective of Hamas. And apparently they also saw a moment of vulnerability in Israel as well. And if we look at the remarks made by the now deceased political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, on October the 7th itself, on the moment, the day of the attacks, when he started to explain what Hamas had done, the very first thing he referred to, I won't read the whole quotation, was what did these defeatists expect? These Arabs were spread the culture of impotence and despair and wanted the path to normalization, to shape this stage of recognition of the enemy. So first thing he referred to was he basically said to Arab states, you thought that you could go ahead and normalize your relations with Israel, that you could build your economic and security future on relations with Israel and the United States, that Israel is kind of strong in the region and is backed up by the US, and you should bet your future on that relationship. We've just shown you, the Arab world, how weak and vulnerable Israel is, and you're making a big mistake betting your future on your relations with Israel. So from the very beginning, in the minds of Hamas leaders, it seems that their vision or their goal was not just about the Gaza Strip, that they were looking regional, at a regional level, at the processes taking place. And what Hamas did was intended, in part at least, to transform the region in such a way as to make those kinds of processes impossible. And I guess one of the big questions for us going forward is, will they succeed in transforming the region in such a way? And I think that whether or not they will succeed will depend a lot on Israeli decision-making going forward. On a lot of things that Israel doesn't control, but on some things that Israel does control. And if we go back, and before I kind of turn over for questions, to that deep divide taking place within the state of Israel. I'm trying to scroll this slide, but it's not working for me right now. Okay, never mind. We see in Israel today a deep, deep divide on the question of many things, which I've already mentioned in this and in previous lectures, but also a question about how to end the war. And I can signify that just with these two quick headlines. When the centrist Israeli leader Benny Gantz, who joined the government on an emergency basis after October the 7th, when he quit the government in June, when he basically said Netanyahu is unwilling to engage or put forward a strategic vision for the region. And what should that strategic vision contain? You can see it in the text underneath the headline on Gantz there. It should be a plan of action to accomplish a number of goals, including advancing normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia and creating an international civilian governance mechanism for Gaza. What Gantz is saying is, we need to defeat Hamas militarily, but that's not enough. To really build a strategic future for the state of Israel, we need to advance normalization with Saudi Arabia. We need to work with allies in the region. We need to work with the United States to build a future vision of the region that includes a future governance for the Gaza Strip, which isn't under Israeli, which won't be Israeli governance, which is what the far right in the coalition wants, but some other kind of system. Ultimately involving, Gantz may not have said this explicitly, but some kind of alternative Palestinian leadership, some involvement of the Palestinian Authority. And we see that inside the coalition, The current defense minister, Benny Gantz, many people, it seems from our reports in Israel, he won't be defense minister very much longer. He keeps attacking Netanyahu publicly for not articulating a future for the region. He's also calling for an agreement, a deal to get the hostages home that will also enable a ceasefire agreement that will get Hezbollah off Israel's northern border. And he's also talked explicitly in cabinet meetings that have been leaked, and I may also have spoken about it publicly, I'm trying to recall, but he's also talked about the need to bring in alternative Palestinian leaders to the Gaza Strip, whether it's the PA or something else, to replace Hamas, and Netanyahu refuses to engage in these discussions. So we see, if I come back to kind of one of the core threads of this series of talks, the deep divide within the state of Israel that I've talked about, the deep divide about what Israel stands for, what kind of society Israel is going to be, about the relationship between Israel's Jewish character and democratic character, which is sort of mixed up with this immediate political crisis, the fact that Netanyahu is on trial and dependent on far-right elements to stay in power, is affecting every kind of decision that Israel takes, including the decision about how to end the current war, which relates to the question about how Israel can exploit or take advantage of the opportunities that were becoming apparent in the region before October the 7th, in terms of Israel's integration with Arab states in the region. Okay, I think I've spoken more than enough, so I'm going to stop the share and open it up to questions.
Hey, thank you, Toby. I'm going to jump right into questions because we have quite a few. And I'll start with the earlier ones about Iran. If Iran's desire is driven by wanting the Shiite Islam sect to be the predominant force in the Muslim world, and what would you say their main motives are?
Yes, so I think with Iran, it's a mixture of motives. Yes, of course, the sectarian division between Sunni and Shia in the Islamic world is part of it. This is ideology and theology and religious beliefs matter to these people without a shadow of a doubt. Matters to the regime, to the IRGC, which is the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, which is the kind of vanguard of Iran's regional strategy. Yes, absolutely, that's an important part of it, but that's mixed up with strategic rivalries, anti-Western, anti-colonial ideas, and all kinds of great, power rivalry that would exist even, without the religious element, the Arab versus Persian ethnic difference as well. So all kinds of different things mixed together there, but without a shadow of a doubt, the Sunni Shia sectarian divide is part of it.
Okay, another question. Jordan was absent from some of the photos that you showed us. However, they did come to Israel's aid during the missile attack. Do you have a comment about what prompted that? Was that doing us a favor in favor of what you mentioned with the water and energy, or was it based more on earlier help between Jordan and Israel?
So really good question. For Jordan, things are very sensitive. As you may be aware, Jordan has a very, very large Palestinian population. It's a constant balancing act for the Hashemite monarchy to balance between the fact that it has full diplomatic relations with Israel and, of course, quietly a very important security relationship with Israel, and the fact that it has a very large Palestinian population. So that may explain why it was not a sort of founding member of the Negev Forum. There was certainly hope in Israel that in follow-up meetings the Jordanians would join in, but it's very sensitive for Jordan to publicly warm its relations with Israel if it's not linked to some clear progress on addressing the grievances and concerns and national demands of Palestinians. But we know, of course, that there is strong security cooperation between the states. The stability and security of Jordan is understood by at least mainstream Israeli leaders as being very, very important for Israel. And Jordan has a very close relationship with the US. And so, yeah, it was part of that kind of quiet alliance that worked with Israel to repel the Iranian missile and rocket attacks on April the 13th. And we hear increasing reports of Iran itself trying to infiltrate through Jordan, to disrupt through Jordan, to agitate in Jordan. And so there is a specific growing grievance of Jordan of itself towards Iran as well.
Okay, thank you. There are more questions coming in, so I'm trying to prioritize. In terms of the Palestinian population, wider than the Hamas point of view on this, what are the different points of views on these normalizations and how they're affecting the Palestinian questions? Are there any within the Palestinian society that are actually looking at this and kind of supporting it in any way?
So the response of the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to the normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain under the Abraham Accords was essentially, this is a great betrayal of the Palestinian cause by these Arab states that at one time said no normalization of relations with Israel without a Palestinian state, and then basically gave up on the Palestinian state. I mean, the Emiratis did make some demands on Israel. They demanded that Israel give up the idea at the time, this is in 2020, of annexing parts of the West Bank, which Netanyahu had put on the table. So they didn't ignore the Palestinian question completely, but it was not like it was in the past. So yes, for most Palestinians, this is perceived as a great betrayal. An interesting, I think perhaps some exception may be among Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel, for whom this kind of normalization represents a significant opportunity. And we'll see in the future. It may be that Palestinian leaders try to be more pragmatic, and work with these Arab states and try to leverage the normalization to bring about or realize their own national goals and to bring benefits themselves in terms of greater Arab engagement and investment in their welfare. But that kind of pragmatism was not present when the agreements were signed.
Okay, one more question about the Arab point of view before I move to all the questions about the Israeli point of view. Since October 7th, were there any major shifts within the Arab states and their attitude to this normalization?
Yeah, I'm glad that question's come up, because I would have spoken a bit more about it. Of course, as you can imagine, attitudes towards Israel and the United States in the context of the war, in the Arab world, have hardened. I mean, of course, that very negative attitudes were prevalent even before October the 7th. But you can imagine, if you're an Arab citizen anywhere in the Arab world, the kind of images and headlines and constant wave of coverage coming out of the Gaza Strip and what's happened there, how that would affect your attitude towards the State of Israel and towards the United States. And that, of course, and that coupled with the sort of rhetoric coming out of the Israeli far right present in the government, kind of things happening on the Temple Mount, it makes it's very difficult and I guess embarrassing for those Arab states that recently normalized their relations with Israel and promoting values of tolerance and coexistence, when you have a far right ministers in the Israeli government who have very exclusivist attitudes towards legitimacy and religion in the region. And of course, if you're, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, it's obviously much more difficult to advance normalization with Israel in this kind of context. That said, no Arab state has renounced its diplomatic relations with the State of Israel. And even in these conditions, Saudi Arabia still talks about the possibility of normalizing relations with the State of Israel, is engaging with the US on these issues, even after 11 months of war. So the underlying drivers, we hope, are still there. But of course, we need some kind of settlement of the current conflict, and most people would assume a very different kind of Israeli leadership to capitalize on those opportunities.
Okay, thank you. We're moving to some questions about the Israeli attitude, and there was a question about the far right Israeli parties and what is their take on these new relationships with Arab states. Do they oppose them? Are they for them?
It's really amazing, actually. From my perspective, if you think about the scale of opportunity represented by these relationships, the extent to which those political parties disregard them almost completely, don't refer to them, don't engage with them, or perhaps only in the sense that they think, okay, look, we can normalize our relations with Arab states, and they don't care about the Palestinians, so we don't need to worry about the Palestinian issue. But against the something that I showed you the headline from Benny Gantz or other Israeli center-left leaders saying, we to defeat this Iranian-led axis, we need to build our relations with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states, and we have this huge opportunity to do so. And the kind of cost has never been lower for the state of Israel to do that. But those far-right ministers are deeply ideologically driven, and those pragmatic state interests don't seem to figure in their thinking whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go just a couple minutes over time because there are a few more questions. Things in the region and here are changing so quickly that questions that were the top questions just a few hours ago have dropped to number 2 and 3 so quickly. But I will start with opinions and thoughts about this move to possibly switch Gallant as the defense minister and bring Sar in instead.
Yeah, I mean, this has sort of created great I'll say bewilderment's not quite the word, because people are, I guess the commentariat in Israel has long since given up being sort of surprised by anything that Netanyahu might propose, but consternation perhaps is the word. Let's see, at least from mainstream Israeli commentators who find it difficult to believe that Netanyahu would consider switching his defense minister, switching out a very experienced general that's been leading the military, leading the Ministry of Defense in Israel's military efforts for the last 11 months, and potentially replace him with an individual with very little or significant military experience whatsoever, purely for political reasons, for no strategic justification for this whatsoever. Creates absolute consternation in Israel. Whether it's actually going to happen or not, I mean, the latest reports I've heard from Israel is that Netanyahu is still absolutely serious about doing this. But puzzling events really in the last few hours appear to have put that on hold, which raises so many complex questions that I'll set it there. I'll leave it there for the moment.
So the last question is exactly, I did receive a question about this latest new event, the beeper explosion, which is that's what pushed the rest of the events down the list. So just first impressions, thoughts, your own opinion. We're obviously catching you, yeah. This is happening now, but any insight or thoughts that you have about this?
Look, I'm not going to pretend for one moment that I can understand exactly what happened, why it was done now, and what's going to happen next. And I'm following, before I came on this call, I was watching the Israeli news. I mean, I think the broad assumption is this is something done by Israel, reflecting some extraordinary capability. But there is real puzzlement, I think, about why it was done. If this is an Israeli capability, something Israel was able to do, again, we don't know, but that's what it's assumed. Why it did it at exactly this moment? Is it connected to a wider plan or a wider strategy? Was it even a mistake that it happened at this moment? There's great puzzlement among the most kind of respected and high-profile experts in Israel right now over that question. And then the question of what will Hezbollah do? I mean, I don't know what has happened in the last hour. It's very, very puzzling. It's got people scratching their heads because, okay, if Israel has this capability, why did it use it in this way at this moment? You would think it would do so. It would deploy it. It's really at a calculated moment as part of a wider strategy. And it's a bit hard to see exactly what that is at this moment. But again, we're so short on information that it's difficult to say.
So I'm going to end this event and series with a question to maybe, we'll also include all of this in the follow-up email, but when you follow news and want to know you're getting reliable information, where do you go to? What are your top sources to get that information and check out the news?
Look, I mean, I think from an English language perspective, we are quite blessed in the sense that we have good quality English language news sources. I guess, and there are many, there are many available, and they come from a range of political perspectives. You can obviously access Haaretz in English through, the Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post. They have different political leanings. They're all professionally run news gathering organizations. You can access a lot of content from Ynet in English, and you can even go on Hebrew language news sources, and you can use Google Translate and get a lot of knowledge out of them. Given the quality of the technology these days, I also follow Hebrew language media. I think you have to have a range of sources, because also a lot of things that you see in Israeli media, you don't see in international media, but there's a lot of things in international media that Israeli media doesn't focus on and report. So you have to really get a range of sources. I guess my main lesson would be, for me, don't overdose on the social media, right? You know how it works. It's feeding you versions of your own preferences. So you have to kind of step out of that bubble, I would recommend, and look at a range of professional news sources, and to try and get a broader picture as you can of what's going on, and speak to people that on the ground and see if it resonates also.
And any preferred of yours? I'm trying to get here, maybe if we have that was a very nice overview of the sources we know. I'm just wondering if there's somewhere that you go. Obviously, this is your personal inclination, and that's fine, but I think I'm curious to know where, or what's your mix? Let's say I have my mix of what field that kind of gives me a full picture. Do you have a specific mix or blend that gives that?
I mean, I was deliberately trying to give a range of sources, not to, because they have different political leanings, but I also there are specific comment. I mean, there are also specific individuals. It helps a little bit if you kind of know, okay, I know something about that person. I followed their work for a long time. I kind of know maybe a little bit there. I know their attitudes. I know their politics a little bit.
So who's yours? I'm gonna get this.
So, well, I mentioned a few. I do read top commentators from Haaretz. They say Amos Harel, for example, is a defense correspondent for Haaretz. I think he's one of the, really excellent. I was watching N12 in Hebrew, and I'm seeing commentators like Amos Yadlin, retired Major General, or Ehudi Ari, veteran Arab affairs correspondent. And I kind of like, okay, I know these people. Nobody's foolproof. They all have their sources, they all have their preferences, they all have their political attitudes, but I kind of know a little bit where they're coming from, so I can kind of read them a little bit. Times of Israel, I think provides very good, especially kind of rolling blog, up to the minute stuff, is really an excellent source. But others are, also providing good resources, like I mentioned, Jerusalem Post, Ynet, and others.
Okay, thank you. So I have here some questions, so I will say you'll receive in this follow-up email the 3 recordings, as well as the video that Toby shared, and the sources and further reading materials, his previous program that we had that was mentioned here. So and of course I was probing for a reason. I'll also include the commentators that Toby just mentioned, so you can follow them yourself too. Toby, thank you very, very much. It was a true pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.